turn it over to you to address how Google Semantic Search, what it is, a little bit of that, but how it affects MBA students' employers, affects their careers, how it affects them as them personally, and then both the students and for baby boomers. So that's a little bit to bite off. You think we can handle that in an hour?
Thank you, Jim, and I'm delighted to be here actually, and very much this is a lot of the stuff which I do all year round in terms of helping large corporations get their executive teams right up to speed. So this is very much the audience, funnily enough, which I had in mind when I was writing the book, and I structured it in a way that is very accessible, precisely because a semantic search from a technical point of view is extremely complicated. We usually say search is not rocket science. Well, semantic search is very close to rocket science, but it doesn't really concern us because its effects are very accessible. And it is probably the biggest disrupt we have faced in terms of marketing and how we operate since the Industrial Revolution. And I say this with quite a very studied approach because the Industrial Revolution was the point where we began to scale things up and create the transactional approach, which has led us for the last 200 years. And before that, everything was very small and personable and worked around or evolved around relationships, which allowed us to examine the value of any kind of transactional kind of relationship we entered into. So we had personal relationships sort of being the bedrock of transactional ones. The world grew big and it became complicated, and we created very complicated structures to be able to operate in that. And those structures were driven by processes, because processes is how companies work, and those processes were broken down into very specific steps, because this is how we control them, and this is how we basically make sure that they work for us and do what we expect them to do. And then with the 21st century, we got into a world which is too complicated and too big, and at the same time really connected. And that created a disrupt in its own right. When you have a world which is so big, what you get is essentially noise, and you get so much noise that it drowns out any kind of signal. This is a paradox because essentially every bit of noise potentially is a signal. And what do I mean by that? Suppose we all started talking at the same time and we are 30 people in a room, and somebody watching those 30 people sees a lot of noise and no signal at all. Yet if we're only talking to 3 people next to us within that large sound which nobody can make head or tail out of, those 3 people can actually connect, and they can create a conversation despite the fact that they're surrounded by noise. So this is the paradox of the party room, where you can actually have a kind of a conversation in a very crowded and loud environment. Now suppose we scale that across the world, and the way we do that, of course, is with search, which means search has to work differently. It has to allow us to create our own signals from the noise which surrounds the big data solution or the big data problem that floats everywhere. And that, in a nutshell, is the outline of how semantic search came to be the force that it is today, and why it actually became a necessity in many ways in the way we operate.